The Summit County courtroom smelled like old carpet and cold coffee. I sat at the plaintiff's table in my navy blazer, hands folded so tight my knuckles had gone white, and I watched my son walk to the witness stand like he was walking to work. Ryan didn't look at me. Not once. Not when the bailiff swore him in. Not when Frank's lawyer, a sharp young woman named Denise Cole, smoothed her blazer and turned to face him with a smile that said she already knew what she was about to get. "Mr. Doyle," she said, "can you describe your relationship with your mother growing up?" Ryan's jaw moved like he was chewing on something bitter. Then he said it, loud enough that the court reporter's fingers froze over her keys for half a second. "She was never a real mother to me." I felt the floor tilt. 28 years of marriage, 30 years of being Ryan's mother, and my own son said it like a fact he'd memorized. Like a line fed to him. My lawyer, Pam, put a hand over mine under the table, but I barely felt it. I kept thinking, whatever happens after this, I need you to stay with me until the end, because this story doesn't end in that courtroom. It ends somewhere Frank never expected me to look. If you've ever had someone you loved say something that couldn't have come from nowhere, you already know how that sentence unravels. Keep watching because it did. The judge called a 10-minute recess. I sat frozen while my whole life rearranged itself around one sentence, and I hadn't even heard the worst of what was coming yet. My name is Margaret Doyle, Maggie, to anyone who's known me more than 5 minutes. I'm 55 years old, and until 8 months ago, I lived at 214 Larchmont Drive in Akron, Ohio, in the brick colonial Frank and I bought in 1997, back when we were young and broke and thought love solved arithmetic. It didn't. We were married 30 years. Frank ran Doyle Auto Sales on Route 8, a used car lot he built from nothing, and I worked in advertising downtown for most of my career, first as a copywriter, later running my own small firm out of a rented office on Main Street. Ryan is our only child, born in October of 1998. He's 28 now, married to a sweet, sharp-eyed woman named Beth, and he runs a small construction outfit, Doyle & Sons, that he started 3 years ago with 2 guys from his old crew. For most of Ryan's life, I thought we were close. I coached his Little League team for 2 seasons. I drove him to Cleveland twice a month for 4 years so he could see a specialist for his asthma. I know I wasn't a perfect mother. Nobody is. But I never once believed "not real" would be the phrase my own son reached for. There was a period, though a bad one back when Ryan was an infant, that I didn't talk about. Not to Ryan, not to my sister Carol, barely to myself. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I was wrong about that too. Everything that happened in that courtroom traced back to those 8 months I'd spent trying very hard to forget. Frank filed for divorce in March. No warning, no fight the night before, just a process server at my office on a Tuesday morning while I was mid-sentence with a client on the phone. Irreconcilable differences, the papers said. I found out 3 weeks later, through my sister, that he'd been seeing a woman named Renee from his church group for the better part of a year. I wasn't surprised exactly. Frank and I had been living like polite roommates for a long time, separate schedules, separate friends, a marriage running on habit instead of anything warmer. What surprised me was how quickly the tone changed once lawyers got involved. Frank's version of our 30 years started sounding like a deposition. Every soft spot in our history got reframed as evidence. The first sign something was wrong with Ryan came in April, over dinner at his place in Cuyahoga Falls. Beth had made pot roast. Ryan barely spoke to me all night, and when I asked if something was bothering him, he said, "Dad says you're trying to take the dealership in the settlement." That wasn't true. I told my lawyer explicitly I didn't want a dime of Doyle Auto Sales, only a fair split of the house and our retirement accounts. But Ryan said it with a hard, flat certainty, like he'd rehearsed it. Beth caught my eye across the table for just a second. Something passed over her face. Worry, maybe, or warning. I didn't understand it yet. I would, eventually. But by then a lot more damage had already been done. My sister, Carol, has lived 2 streets over from me since 2004 in a little Cape Cod she calls her downsize house, and she's the only person who's known me longer than Frank has. She showed up on my porch the Saturday after that dinner with a bottle of wine and a look on her face I recognized from our childhood, the one that meant she'd heard something and was working up the nerve to tell me. Ryan's been spending a lot of time at the dealership, she said. With your husband. And with Gary. Gary Pelham had been Frank's best friend since community college and his general manager at Doyle Auto Sales for almost 20 years. Gary had also, for reasons I never fully understood, always kept a careful distance from me. Polite at Christmas parties, but never warm. I asked Carol what she meant by a lot of time. Ryan's business is in trouble, Maggie. Beth told my hairdresser, who told me. 2 of his guys left last month. He's behind on his equipment loan. She topped off my wine glass without asking. And Frank's been telling him he'll help. If Ryan helps him first. I sat with that for a long moment. Frank had never in his life offered anyone something for nothing, not even our own son. If he was dangling money in front of Ryan during a divorce where Ryan was also going to be asked to testify, that wasn't generosity. That was leverage. I didn't say anything to Ryan about it. I told myself I was giving him the benefit of the doubt. Looking back, I think I was just afraid of what I'd hear if I asked him directly and how much it would confirm. By May, the depositions had started, and I met Denise Cole for the first time, Frank's attorney, 30-something, buttoned up, the kind of lawyer who smiled at you right before she took something from you. She asked me questions about our finances, about the house, about irregularities in the marriage. At one point she asked, almost casually, were there any periods during your son's early childhood where you were separated from him for an extended time? My own lawyer, Pam, objected on relevance, and the deposition moved on. But I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Nobody outside my immediate family knew about 1999. Frank knew. Carol knew, vaguely, though I'd never told her details. My mother had known, before she passed. And apparently, now, Frank's lawyer knew enough to ask about it in a room full of court reporters. That night, I called Ryan. He picked up on the 4th ring, sounding tired. Everything okay, Mom? I wanted to check in. It's been a while since we really talked. There was a pause, longer than it should have been. Things are just complicated right now. Dad needs help with a lot. Beth and I have our own stuff going on. Another pause. I don't really want to be in the middle of this, Mom. Between you and Dad. I told him nobody was asking him to be in the middle. I remember hanging up and sitting in my dark kitchen for a long time, wondering what complicated actually meant, and whether it had anything to do with a version of my life I'd spent almost 30 years trying to bury. I should explain what happened in 1999 because it matters for everything that comes after. Ryan was born in October of 1998, a difficult delivery, and within a few months I was in trouble in a way nobody around me, including me, had language for yet. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I had thoughts I was too ashamed to say out loud. Thoughts about being unfit, about Ryan being better off without me, thoughts that terrified me more than anything ever had. This was Akron in 1999. Postpartum depression wasn't a phrase people used casually at dinner parties. It was something you were supposed to power through, quietly, with a smile on. Frank found me on the bathroom floor one night in February, unable to stop shaking, unable to explain what was wrong. He called my mother, who called an ambulance. I was admitted to a psychiatric unit at a hospital outside Cleveland for treatment, first a stabilization period, then months of inpatient care while my medication was adjusted, and I worked with a therapist who, frankly, saved my life. I was there on and off for close to 8 months. Frank's mother, Eleanor, moved in to help care for Ryan. Frank visited me on weekends at first, less as the months went on. I wrote Ryan letters almost every week. Nothing he could read yet, obviously, just a mother's ramblings to her infant son, promises about who I'd be for him once I came home. I gave every one of those letters to Frank to keep for Ryan. I have no idea, to this day, what Frank actually did with them. I came home in October of 1999, around Ryan's first birthday, thinner than I'd left, careful in a way I hadn't been before, but steady. Frank and I never really talked about those 8 months again. Not with each other, not with Ryan as he grew older. There was an unspoken agreement in our house. That period didn't happen. We didn't hide it exactly. If anyone had asked directly, I might have answered honestly, but nobody asked and Frank never encouraged questions. Looking back now, I understand that silence wasn't really neutral. Silence has a shape. It gets filled in by whoever's standing closest to it, and for almost 30 years, the person standing closest to Ryan, filling in the blanks about his mother's absence during his first year, was Frank. I didn't think about it much at the time. I was so grateful to be alive, so grateful to be present for Ryan's second year, his third, his 10th, that I didn't examine what story he might have been told about the first. I coached his baseball team. I helped him with college applications. I thought, foolishly, that showing up for the next 27 years would speak for itself. It's a strange thing, realizing decades later that somebody rewrote your absence into abandonment, and you spent all that time building a relationship on top of a foundation you never knew had already been poisoned. I didn't know it yet in May, sitting in my kitchen after that phone call with Ryan. But I was about to find out exactly how deep the poison went. June brought the mediation session, a last attempt, mostly for show, before the case went to a full hearing. Frank and I sat across a conference table with our lawyers, and for the first time in months, I really looked at him. He'd lost weight. He looked good, actually, tanned from golfing with Renee's family in Hilton Head, and something about that ease made me angrier than anything he'd said in the depositions. The mediator, a retired judge named Harlan Voss, asked us to try to agree on asset division without a trial. Frank's opening offer was insulting. He wanted the house outright, for sentimental reasons regarding Ryan's childhood, and a token buyout on my share of 30 years of retirement contributions. Pam pushed back hard. Frank's jaw tightened. "You weren't even there for a lot of that childhood," he said low, like it slipped out before he could stop it. The room went quiet. Pam asked for a recess before I could respond. In the hallway, she told me she thought Frank was building toward something specific, that the sentimental language about the house, combined with Denise's deposition question about early separation, suggested they intended to argue I'd forfeited some moral claim to the marital home because of an extended absence from Ryan's infancy. I told her the absence had a name. It was called postpartum depression, and I'd been hospitalized, not vacationing. Pam nodded slowly and said something that stuck with me. "That's the truth. But truth only helps you if it makes it into the record before their version does." I didn't sleep that night at all. I decided to talk to Ryan directly in person, instead of over the phone. I drove to his job site on a Thursday afternoon in late June, a half-built house off Portage Trail, and found him on a break, sitting on a stack of lumber with a sandwich he wasn't really eating. "Mom." He looked surprised and not entirely happy about it. "What are you doing here?" I sat next to him, careful with my knees on the uneven ground, and I asked him plainly, what had Frank told him about me, about our marriage, about anything from before he could remember. Ryan was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Dad told me you were gone a long time when I was a baby. Almost a year. He said you were focused on your career, on the ad agency thing you were building. That Grandma Eleanor basically raised me that whole first year, because you weren't around." I felt my chest cave in a little. "Ryan, I didn't leave you for a job. I was sick. I was in the hospital." "Sick how?" I started to explain postpartum depression, the hospitalization, the letters I wrote him every week, and I watched something complicated cross his face. Not quite disbelief. More like a man trying to fit new furniture into a room he'd already decorated a specific way for 28 years. "Dad never said anything about a hospital," he said finally, "or letters." He looked at me hard. Why would he lie about something like that? I didn't have an answer yet, but I intended to find one. That conversation should have been the beginning of something better between Ryan and me. Instead, within a week, he'd gone cold again, colder if anything. He stopped returning my calls promptly. Beth texted me once, late at night, just 3 words. "He's confused, Maggie." I asked her to explain, and she never responded. I found out why 2 weeks later from Carol, who'd heard it from a cousin who still worked part-time at Doyle Auto Sales. Frank had sat Ryan down at the dealership and told him a different story, that I'd been the one to bring up the so-called hospitalization now, decades later, purely as a legal strategy to win sympathy in the divorce and take the house. That I was rewriting history to get what I want, in Frank's words, exactly when it was convenient. It was a masterstroke in its way. Frank didn't need to disprove what I'd told Ryan. He just needed to reframe the timing of it, make my honesty look like manipulation, my vulnerability look like a tactic. And into that confusion, he offered Ryan something concrete: full forgiveness of the $15,000 personal loan Ryan owed him for his equipment, and a promise to co-sign a new business loan if Ryan would simply tell the truth as he understood it at the upcoming hearing.
I didn't know all of this yet in late June.
I only knew that my son, who'd looked at me on that lumber pile with something like the beginning of understanding, was disappearing again, faster than before. The hearing was 6 weeks away. The hearing began on a gray Tuesday in August, and I want to tell you exactly how it felt, because I think anyone who's ever been blindsided in public will recognize it. Denise Cole called Ryan as her first witness, not Frank himself, not Renee, my own son, first, before anyone else got a chance to speak. That alone told me how carefully this had been staged. Ryan wore a shirt I'd bought him for his college graduation. I noticed that detail and hated myself a little for noticing it, for still cataloging small tender things about him, even as I watched him prepare to hurt me. Denise walked him through his childhood in broad strokes: happy memories, little league, birthdays, building a portrait of ordinary family life before she pivoted, sharply, to his infancy. Ryan, were you aware that your mother was absent for a significant portion of your first year of life? Yes. His voice was steady. Too steady. Can you describe what you understand about that absence? She left. For almost a year. My grandmother raised me that whole time because my mom was focused on other things, building her career. He glanced at Frank just once, like he was checking his footing. And then a few months ago, out of nowhere, right in the middle of the divorce, she suddenly claims she was in some hospital the whole time. Nobody in this family ever heard that story before now. Denise let that sit in the air like smoke. Then she asked her next question, the one Frank's whole strategy had been built toward. In your opinion, was your mother a real mother to you during that time? She was never a real mother to me. I've relived that sentence more times than I can count, trying to locate the exact moment my son's voice became my husband's voice, wearing my son's face. Denise thanked him, composed as ever, and sat down. Pam rose for cross-examination, and I watched her lay a foundation, brick by careful brick, the way good lawyers do. Ryan, who told you your mother was focused on her career during that year? My dad. Growing up. Did your mother ever tell you that herself?
No.
Never, not until a few weeks ago. And when she told you about a hospitalization for postpartum depression a few weeks ago, did you ask her for any documentation? Medical records?
Dates?
Ryan hesitated.
No.
Did your father provide you documentation of his version, that she left voluntarily for career reasons? No, I grew up with that being the story. Nobody ever really questioned it. Pam nodded slowly, like she was filing that answer away for later, and moved on to safer ground before sitting down. I watched Ryan step down from the stand and walk past our table without a glance, straight to Frank's side of the gallery, where he sat next to Beth, who would not meet my eyes. During the recess in the hallway, Beth caught up to me by the water fountain. She looked around once, like she was checking who might overhear, and said quietly, "There's a storage unit. Frank's mother stuff. I think you should see what's in it before this goes any further." I didn't understand yet what she meant. I would very soon. I asked Beth to explain, right there in the hallway, but she shook her head and said it wasn't the place. Not here. Not with him watching. She meant Frank, who was 30 feet away, talking low and satisfied with Denise and Gary Pelham, the three of them like a small, tidy conspiracy. The hearing recessed for the day after Frank's own testimony, which was calm and rehearsed, full of phrases like, "I did my best to hold this family together while Margaret pursued other priorities." I sat in my car in the courthouse parking garage for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home, replaying Ryan's sentence on a loop, feeling 30 years of motherhood collapse into 6 words spoken by a stranger, wearing my son's face. Carol was waiting on my porch when I got home, a casserole dish balanced on her knee, and she took one look at me and didn't say anything at all, just wrapped both arms around me right there on the front steps and let me shake. Inside, over reheated lasagna neither of us really ate, I told her about Beth, about the storage unit, about the strange, urgent way she'd looked around before she spoke. Carol went quiet for a moment. "Eleanor's storage unit," she said finally. Frank's mother kept everything. She never threw out so much as a birthday card. She looked at me carefully. Maggie, if there's anything left from back then, anything real, it would be in that unit. Eleanor wouldn't have thrown it away, even if Frank asked her to. For the first time in weeks, something in my chest that had felt like grief started to feel, instead, like the beginning of resolve. Eleanor Doyle had passed 3 years earlier, and her storage unit, a 10 by 10 space off Route 224 that the family had quietly kept paying for ever since, out of some mix of nostalgia and nobody wanting to be the one to deal with it, had, as far as I knew, never been fully sorted. Frank always said he'd get to it eventually. I suspected, now, that Frank knew exactly what was in there and had no interest in anyone else getting to it first. Beth called me 2 nights later, this time from her car in a grocery store parking lot, her voice low. "I still have a key," she said. "Ryan's name is on the unit too, from when we helped Eleanor move some furniture in. I don't think Frank remembers that." I asked her, carefully, why she was willing to help me.
There was a long pause on the line.
"Because Ryan's been miserable since that hearing," she said finally. "He barely talks. He won't look at pictures of you two together. And when I brought up your face when he said that thing on the stand, he shut down completely. Maggie, I don't think my husband actually believes what he said. I think he's terrified he doesn't know what's true anymore, and it's easier to just repeat the story he's always been told than to find out he's been wrong his whole life." I told her I understood that fear better than she knew. We agreed to meet at the storage unit that Saturday morning, while Frank was at a car auction 3 hours away in Columbus, and Ryan was working a job site with no idea what his wife and his mother were about to find. The unit smelled like dust and cedar and 40 years of a family's forgotten things. Beth and I worked through boxes of Christmas ornaments, old dealership ledgers, a box of Ryan's baby clothes that made my throat tighten. We were almost ready to give up when Beth pulled a battered gray filing box down from a high shelf, the kind with a metal clasp, labeled in Eleanor's careful handwriting, MD, Personal, 1999. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside were photocopies of my hospital intake and discharge paperwork from 1999, the diagnosis written plainly across the top. Major postpartum depressive episode with psychotic features, inpatient treatment, 8 months. Beneath the medical records was a stack of envelopes, maybe 30 of them, addressed in my own handwriting to baby Ryan, the letters I had written every week from that hospital bed, believing Frank had kept them for the day Ryan could read. Every single one was unopened. Beth sat down hard on an overturned milk crate, both hands over her mouth. I unfolded one at random with fingers that didn't feel like my own. "Dear Ryan, I miss you so much today I can barely breathe. The doctors say I'm getting better. I promise you I am fighting my way back to you. Dated March 1999. Never opened. Never given to my son. Kept, instead, in his grandmother's storage unit for 27 years. Evidence of a truth Frank had decided nobody needed." I looked at Beth.
"He knew," I said.
"The whole time. He knew exactly what happened to me, and he built a completely different story instead." We found one more thing at the bottom of the box that changed the shape of everything, a short note in Eleanor's handwriting, dated 2003, folded once and tucked behind the last letter. It read, in part, "Frank asked me to throw these away. I couldn't do it. Ryan deserves to know his mother someday, whatever Frank decides to tell him in the meantime. I'm keeping them safe until then." Eleanor had known too. Whatever her reasons for not intervening while she was alive, loyalty to her son, fear of the family fracturing, simple age and passivity, she had, in her own quiet way, refused to let the truth disappear completely. She'd left a door open, even if she never walked through it herself. Beth photographed every page with her phone, methodical despite the tears on her face, while I sat on a folding chair in that dusty unit holding 27 years of unread letters to my son. I felt something I hadn't expected, not just vindication, but a strange, aching gratitude toward a mother-in-law who'd never been warm to me in life, but who had, in the end, protected the one piece of truth that mattered most. "I have to show Ryan," Beth said finally. "Tonight. Before the next hearing date. He can't go back on that stand and repeat what he said without knowing this exists." I asked her if she wanted me there when she told him, and she shook her head. Let me go first. He needs to hear it from me before he can hear it from you. If I bring you in too fast, he'll think it's another performance. She wasn't wrong. I drove home alone that afternoon, the box locked safely in my trunk, feeling for the first time in months like I had solid ground under my feet. Beth called me at 11 that night, her voice thick. She'd shown Ryan everything. The medical records, the letters, Eleanor's note, laid out on their kitchen table while their dog paced anxiously between them, sensing something was wrong. Ryan hadn't said much at first, she told me. He just picked up one letter, read it silently, put it down, and picked up another. He read almost all of them, Beth said. It took him 2 hours. He didn't say a word the whole time. Then he just put his head down on the table and cried like I've never seen him cry, not even at his grandmother's funeral. I asked her what he'd said, once he could speak. He kept saying, "Why didn't she ever tell me herself?" And I told him, "Maggie, I told him what I actually think, which is that you probably thought you didn't need to. You thought 30 years of showing up would speak for itself. You didn't know there was a competing story running underneath the whole time." That landed on me harder than I expected. I had assumed, all these years, that love expressed through presence was enough, that if I simply kept showing up, kept coaching Little League and driving to Cleveland and being there, the truth of who I was would be self-evident. I hadn't accounted for the fact that somebody else had been quietly writing a different book about me the entire time and handing chapters of it to my son whenever he was young enough to believe it without question. Beth told me Ryan wanted to see me. Not tomorrow. Tonight, if I was willing. I told her I'd already grabbed my keys. I drove to Cuyahoga Falls a little after midnight, the letter still boxed in my trunk from the storage unit, and found Ryan sitting alone on his front porch steps in the dark, the porch light off, like he didn't want to be fully seen yet. I sat down next to him, without a word. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said, so quietly I almost missed it, "I said it on a witness stand, Mom. In front of a judge. In front of you." His voice cracked. "I called you not a real mother, and the whole time you were writing me letters from a hospital bed, and Dad just let me grow up believing something that wasn't even close to true." I told him the truth, as gently as I could, that I understood why he believed it, because a child has no reason to question a story an adult tells with total confidence, especially a story told by the parent who is actually there every single day. I told him I didn't blame him for believing Frank. I told him what I couldn't forgive, yet, was the 27 years of silence that let that story calcify into something he built his whole understanding of me around. Ryan turned to look at me for the first time all night, his eyes wet in the dim porch light. "What do we do now?" I said the only true thing I had. "We tell the truth. Out loud. Where it counts." I reached over and took his hand, the same hand I used to hold crossing Portage Trail on the way to Little League practice 20 years earlier, and for the first time since that courtroom, it felt like my son again. The next hearing date was 10 days away, and in that window, Ryan did something I hadn't expected. He went to Frank himself, alone, and confronted him directly at the dealership. He told me about it afterward, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't touch. He'd walked into Frank's office at Doyle Auto Sales, set copies of the letters on the desk, and asked one question. "Why did you let me believe she abandoned me, when you knew this whole time she was sick and wrote me letters every single week?" According to Ryan, Frank went very still, staring at the pages for a long moment before he finally spoke. "I was 26 years old with a newborn and a wife who didn't recognize her own reflection some days," Frank said. "I didn't know if she was ever coming back the same person. I was scared and ashamed, and I didn't know how to explain any of that to a baby, let alone to the town we lived in. It was easier to just say she was busy. Easier for everyone. Easier for you," Ryan had said back. Frank hadn't denied it. He'd also, notably, not apologized, not yet anyway. He told Ryan the loan forgiveness and the new business loan were still on the table, no strings, which Ryan told me made him feel sick to his stomach, like Frank still didn't understand that money was never going to fix what he'd broken. Ryan left the letters on the desk and walked out without answering him. It wasn't the confrontation I'd imagined having myself. But hearing that my son had found the courage to have it on my behalf meant more to me than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. Word of what Ryan had found traveled faster than any of us expected. Gary Pelham called me directly, 2 days before the next hearing, his voice heavy on the phone. "I need to tell you something, Maggie, and I should have told you a long time ago." Gary admitted he'd known, roughly, that something wasn't right about the story Frank told. He'd been around in 1999. He remembered Frank showing up to work gray-faced and hollow-eyed those months, remembered Eleanor moving in abruptly to help out. He said Frank had told him, back then, the same career-focused story he later told Ryan, and Gary had simply never questioned it, the way you don't question your best friend's version of his own marriage. "I should have asked more questions," Gary said, especially when Denise started building the case around it this year. "I knew something felt off about how confident Frank was that Ryan would say what he said on that stand. I just told myself it wasn't my business."
He paused.
"It is now, though. If you need me to say what I remember from back then, Frank looking wrecked, Eleanor moving in overnight, none of it matching up with she just wanted her career, I'll say it. Under oath, if it comes to that." I thanked him, genuinely surprised. It was a small crack of decency in a situation that had felt, for months, like it was built entirely out of people protecting Frank's version of events. It wasn't forgiveness for Gary's years of silence, but it was something, and after the last several months, I'd learned to take truth wherever I could find it, however late it arrived. With the letters and medical records now in Pam's hands, the legal strategy shifted fast. But something else surfaced in that same stretch of days, a complication I hadn't seen coming, tangled up in Ryan's business troubles, the ones Carol had first warned me about back in April. Beth came to me privately, apart from Ryan, and told me the full extent of it. Doyle and Sons construction wasn't just a little behind. It was nearly finished. Ryan was 6 weeks from losing his equipment to repossession, and he'd been too proud and too frightened to tell either of us how bad it had gotten. Frank's dangled bailout hadn't been generosity. It had been precisely timed, an offer that arrived the same week Ryan learned he might lose everything he'd built. "He didn't testify against you for no reason, Maggie," Beth said carefully. "He believed what he said, mostly. But he also knew if he didn't say it, Dad was going to pull the loan offer, and Ryan genuinely didn't know how we were going to make rent, let alone save the business." She looked ashamed telling me this, like it implicated her too. "I let him do it. I told him just to get through the hearing, and we'd figure out the business separately. I didn't think it through enough to realize what it would actually cost you." I sat with that for a long time after she left. It reframed everything. Ryan hadn't simply repeated a lie out of blind loyalty to his father. He'd made a desperate, frightened choice under real financial pressure, the kind that makes people say things they don't fully examine. It didn't erase the hurt, but it explained it in a way that made room for something other than anger. I asked Pam, my lawyer, what our options were, now that we understood the financial pressure sitting underneath Ryan's testimony. She was quiet for a moment, then said something practical and a little bit cold, the way good lawyers sometimes have to be. "We can use this financial coercion of a witness, dangled in exchange for testimony favorable to one party in a divorce. That's not nothing, Maggie. It goes to credibility. It goes to Frank's conduct generally." Part of me wanted exactly that. Wanted Frank exposed in open court for what he'd done, layer by layer, the isolation, the hidden letters, the manipulation of our son's desperation. But another part of me, sitting in my kitchen with Ryan's unfinished coffee still on the table from days before, felt something more complicated. If I went after Frank with everything Pam had available, Ryan would be dragged through it too, his failing business, his fear, his choices, all of it entered into a public record for a courtroom of strangers to judge. I called Carol that night and talked it through out loud, the way I've done with her since we were girls sharing a bedroom. "You're allowed to want justice and also want to protect your son," she told me. "Those aren't opposites, Maggie. You just have to figure out which one matters more to you 5 years from now, when the divorce is old news and Ryan's still your son." I sat with that a long time after we hung up. I thought about what kind of ending I actually wanted, not just to win, but to still have something worth having once the winning was done. By the next morning, I had a decision, and I called Pam to tell her exactly how I wanted to proceed. I told Pam I wanted the truth in the record. The letters, the medical documentation, Gary's account of 1999, but I didn't want Ryan's financial desperation weaponized as a separate line of attack. I wanted this hearing to correct the lie about who I was to my son. I did not want it to become a public trial of Ryan's failing business or his fear. Pam pushed back gently, reminding me it might have strengthened our position on the asset division. I told her I understood, and I didn't care. I'm not trying to win a war against my own son, I said. I'm trying to get back the truth Frank stole from both of us. She respected it. In the end, though I could tell it cost her something professionally to leave a strong card on the table. We built our approach instead around the documents. Undeniable, dated, impossible to spin as some late invention for the divorce, since the discharge paperwork and Eleanor's note predated any of this by over 2 decades. Meanwhile, Ryan came to me with something of his own decision. He wanted to file a formal correction to his testimony, an affidavit acknowledging what he'd learned since the hearing, submitted voluntarily rather than compelled. His lawyer friend from college warned him it might look bad, recanting testimony mid-case. Ryan told him he didn't care how it looked. I said something under oath that turned out to be false, he told me later. I'm not going to let that stand just because changing it is inconvenient for the timeline. I hadn't expected, going into that final stretch before the next hearing, that watching my son choose integrity over convenience would end up being one of the proudest moments of the entire ordeal. Frank, for his part, did not go quietly. Denise Cole filed a motion trying to exclude the storage unit documents entirely, arguing they were improperly obtained, a bold claim, given that Beth's name was legally on the unit's access list from years earlier. The judge, a measured woman named Judge Alvarez who had said very little through the earlier proceedings, denied the motion in a single dry sentence. Documents legally accessed by a listed party are not subject to exclusion merely because their contents are inconvenient. I allowed myself, for the first time in this entire process, a small private smile in the gallery. Frank tried one more thing before the hearing resumed. He called me directly, which he hadn't done in months, bypassing the lawyers entirely. His voice on the phone was tight, almost pleading, in a register I hadn't heard from him since we were very young. Maggie, we don't need to do this in a courtroom. We can work something out. For Ryan's sake. I told him the time for working something out quietly had been 1999, when he could have simply given our son his mother's letters instead of hiding them in a storage unit for 27 years. I told him I wasn't interested in another quiet arrangement built on things staying unsaid. Then I hung up, and for the first time in a long time, my hands weren't shaking afterward. That night, Carol came over with wine again, and we sat on my porch, the same porch where she'd found me collapsed after the first hearing, and I told her I finally felt something shift. Not triumph exactly, just the settling feeling of standing on ground that was at last actually solid. The second hearing opened with Ryan's affidavit, read into the record by Pam before any live testimony resumed. It laid out, plainly, what he'd learned since his original testimony, the medical records, the unopened letters, Eleanor's note, and his own acknowledgement that his earlier statement had been based entirely on a version of events his father had told him as a child, never independently verified, and now directly contradicted by primary documentation. Denise objected on several grounds. Judge Alvarez allowed the affidavit into the record over her objections, noting dryly that a witness correcting sworn testimony in light of new evidence was precisely the kind of development courts exist to accommodate. Then Ryan asked, through Pam, for permission to speak briefly and voluntarily. Judge Alvarez allowed it. He stood, faced the judge rather than either of his parents, and said, "I want the court to know I was wrong. My mother was hospitalized for a serious postpartum mental health crisis when I was an infant. She wrote me letters every week she was gone. My father kept those letters from me for 27 years and let me believe she'd chosen to leave. What I said on this stand in August was not true, and I take responsibility for saying it without ever asking to see proof." The courtroom was very quiet. I watched Frank's face during Ryan's statement, not triumphant, not angry, just gray and still, like a man watching a structure he'd built collapse slowly, one beam at a time, and finally accepting there was nothing left to prop up. Gary Pelham testified next, exactly as he'd promised on the phone. He described Frank in 1999, hollowed out, gray, saying almost nothing at work for weeks, and Eleanor moving in abruptly to help with the baby. He said he'd always understood, from context if not direct statement, that something serious had happened to Maggie, and that Frank's later career story had never quite matched what Gary remembered witnessing firsthand. Denise tried to rattle him on cross, suggesting his memory of events 27 years old might be unreliable, colored by recent conversations with the family. Gary held steady. "I've known Frank Doyle since we were 19 years old," he said. "I know what my best friend looked like the year he was ashamed of something. I saw that face in 1999. I hadn't seen it since, until this case started." Frank's own testimony, when Denise finally called him again, was noticeably different from his first appearance, less rehearsed, more halting. Under Pam's cross-examination, he eventually admitted, in a flat, defeated voice, that he had received the letters from me during my hospitalization, that he had chosen not to give them to Ryan as he grew older, and that he had, over the years, allowed and at times actively encouraged a narrative that framed my absence as a choice rather than a medical crisis. "Why?" Pam asked him directly. Frank was quiet for a long moment. "Because admitting the truth meant admitting I didn't know how to handle my wife being sick," he said finally. "It was easier to be angry at her than to be scared for her. I stayed angry for 27 years because it was simpler than being scared." It wasn't the confession of a monster. It was the confession of a frightened, prideful man who'd made a cowardly choice at 26 and then spent decades reinforcing it rather than correcting it, because correcting it would have meant admitting, out loud, that he'd been wrong for the better part of 30 years. I sat in that courtroom and felt something I hadn't expected to feel toward Frank in months. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a strange, exhausted kind of understanding. His father, Ryan's grandfather, had been a hard, unsentimental man from what little Frank had ever told me about him. Someone who considered any kind of mental or emotional struggle a private shame, not something you spoke about, let alone sought help for. Frank had grown up in a house where illness like mine would have been treated as a family secret to be managed rather than a crisis, to be met with compassion. He hadn't invented that instinct. He'd inherited it, and passed a version of it down to Ryan without either of them fully realizing what they were carrying. That didn't excuse 27 years of a lie that shaped my son's entire understanding of who I was. But it explained the shape of it, why a man who wasn't cruel by nature had still done something so quietly devastating and kept doing it year after year, rather than face what admitting the truth would cost him. Judge Alvarez recessed the hearing for the day shortly after Frank's testimony concluded. In the hallway afterward, for the first time in this entire process, Frank looked at me directly and said, quietly, "I'm sorry, Maggie. I should have given you back to our son a long time ago." I didn't answer him, but I heard it. The financial settlement, once all the testimony concluded, moved faster than any of us expected. Judge Alvarez, it turned out, had little patience left for Frank's earlier, sentimental arguments about the house once the full context of the hidden letters was on record. I received a fair split of the marital assets, including enough from the house sale to put a reasonable down payment on a smaller place, a little bungalow on Merriman Road I'd had my eye on for months without quite admitting it to myself. But the settlement, in the end, mattered less to me than what happened outside the courtroom that same week. Ryan called me and asked if he could come by on a Sunday alone, no Beth this time, just the two of us. He arrived with a box of his own, not letters this time, but a stack of drawings and school projects from elementary school, things Frank's mother had apparently saved and Ryan had found while going through more of Eleanor's things after our discovery. "I wanted you to have these," he said. "I think Grandma kept them because she knew, someday, you'd want to see what you missed being able to see the first time. She just never figured out how to actually give them to you while she was alive." We sat at my kitchen table and went through them together. A lopsided clay dinosaur from second grade, a report on the solar system with Ryan D. misspelled at the top, a drawing of my family that included, unmistakably, a stick figure labeled MOM standing right beside Dad, from a boy who, at 6 years old, apparently hadn't yet learned the story he'd later be told about, who counted as real family and who didn't. Ryan's business troubles were still very real, separate from anything Frank had offered him, and I want to be honest about how that got resolved, because it mattered to me that it happened the right way rather than the easy way. I didn't simply hand him money to make the problem disappear. That felt, after everything, like exactly the kind of shortcut that had caused so much of this damage in the first place. Instead, I sat down with Ryan and Beth and helped them put together an honest picture of the business, what was salvageable, what wasn't, what a bank would actually need to see to extend him a legitimate loan on his own merits rather than his father's leverage. I co-signed, alongside Ryan, a modest bridge loan through my own credit union, the kind with real terms and real accountability, not a favor dangled in exchange for anything. Ryan lost one piece of equipment to repossession before the loan came through, a setback, but not the collapse he'd been dreading. He kept both remaining guys on his crew, picked up 2 new residential contracts through a referral from, of all people, Gary Pelham, who apparently felt he owed the family something concrete after everything that had come out. By late autumn, Doyle and Sons was still small, still fragile, but standing on its own legs for the first time since Ryan had started it. "I don't ever want to owe Dad anything again," Ryan told me one evening, going over invoices at my new kitchen table. "Not money, not loyalty he thinks he's bought. I want whatever I build from now on to actually be mine." I told him that sounded like exactly the right way to start rebuilding, not just a business, but a life built on something sturdier than convenient stories. Frank and Renee married quietly the following spring, a small ceremony I heard about secondhand and felt almost nothing about, which surprised me more than any anger would have. Ryan didn't attend. He told his father, gently but firmly, that he needed more time before he could sit in a room celebrating a new chapter of Frank's life while still working through what the last 27 years of the old one had cost him. I want to be clear that this wasn't a simple villain gets punished story, satisfying as that might sound. Frank lost the dealership's local reputation somewhat. Word travels in a town like ours, and the divorce hearing hadn't stayed entirely private. But he wasn't destroyed. He kept the business, kept most of his savings, married a woman who by every account genuinely cared for him. Life rarely hands out consequences as cleanly as we might want. What actually changed, in the months that followed, was smaller and quieter than any courtroom verdict. Ryan started calling me on Sundays, just to talk, the way he had as a teenager before things went distant. Beth and I got closer too, bonded in a strange way by everything we'd uncovered together in that dusty storage unit. Carol, ever practical, helped me pick paint colors for the bungalow on Merriman Road, a soft sage green for the kitchen that Ryan said reminded him of Eleanor's old porch. One evening in late October, almost exactly a year after that first devastating hearing, Ryan came by with a folder under his arm. Inside were photocopies he'd made of every single letter I'd written him in 1999, the real ones, finally, given to their intended reader 27 years late. "I want to actually read these with you," he said. "Not alone this time. With you telling me what you meant." We sat at my kitchen table that evening and went through the letters one by one, and this is where the truth I hadn't fully understood myself came into focus, because reading my own words back to my adult son, 27 years later, I realized something I'd buried even for myself. I hadn't just written those letters as reassurance for Ryan someday. I'd written them, in the depths of that hospital stay, because I was terrified I might not survive that period at all, and I wanted something of my love for him to exist in the world regardless of what happened to me. One letter, dated May 1999, said plainly, "I don't know if I'm going to get better, Ryan. But I need you to know, whenever you read this, that not getting better was never about not loving you enough. It was about being sick in a way I couldn't control. Please don't ever let anyone tell you I chose to be away from you. I would have given anything to be home." Ryan read that one twice, silently, before he could speak. "He read this," Ryan said, finally, meaning Frank. "He had to have read at least some of these, to know what was in them well enough to hide them. And he still chose to tell me the opposite for 27 years. That was the real twist underneath everything. Not just that Frank had hidden the letters, but that he'd clearly read enough of them to know exactly how much they would have changed Ryan's understanding of me, and buried them anyway, because the truth was harder for him to sit with than the lie. I hadn't been erased by accident. I'd been erased on purpose, by someone who knew precisely what he was erasing. I asked Ryan, gently, if he wanted to confront Frank about that specific detail. The fact that hiding the letters required actually reading them first, understanding their weight, and choosing to bury that weight rather than hand it to his own son. Ryan thought about it for a long moment. I already asked him, he said. At the dealership, back before the second hearing. I didn't tell you everything he said that day. He paused. He told me he read maybe 5 or 6 of them, early on, right after you were admitted. He said reading them made him feel like he was failing you because he didn't know how to fix whatever was wrong, and he couldn't stand feeling that helpless. So he stopped reading them. He put the rest away without opening them, and somewhere along the way, not reading them turned into not giving them to me at all, and then into telling a completely different story, so he wouldn't have to explain why he had them in the first place. It was, in its way, a small mercy to hear, not because it excused anything, but because it clarified the shape of Frank's failure. He hadn't set out, calculatedly, to erase me from Ryan's history. He'd made one frightened, self-protective choice at 26, and then, rather than correct it, he'd spent decades building an entire narrative architecture to justify that first cowardly decision, brick by brick, until the lie was sturdier in his mind than the truth had ever been. I don't think he's a monster, Ryan said quietly. I think he's just a man who got scared once and never figured out how to stop being scared. I told him that was probably the most accurate thing anyone had said about his father since this whole thing started. There was one more piece of the reveal that came out in those weeks, something Beth uncovered while going through more of Eleanor's papers, tucked into an old recipe box of all places. It was a short, unsent letter from Eleanor to me, dated 2001, 2 years after I'd come home. That read, "Margaret, I think you deserve to know Ryan's letters. I've told Frank twice that keeping them from the boy isn't right. He says it's not my business. I'm not sure that's true anymore, but I don't know how to go against my own son on this. I hope you'll forgive me someday for staying quiet." Reading that, sitting at my kitchen table with Beth across from me, I felt something complicated. Not quite forgiveness for Eleanor, who had, after all, known and stayed silent for 2 decades, but something close to it. She'd tried, in her limited way, twice, and been overruled by her own son, and rather than force the issue against him directly, she'd chosen the quieter rebellion of simply refusing to destroy the evidence. It wasn't heroism, but it wasn't nothing either. I thought about how many people in this story had made some version of that same choice. Gary, staying quiet for years before finally speaking up. Beth, initially agreeing to let Ryan testify before her conscience caught up with her. Eleanor, refusing to burn the letters, but never quite forcing Frank's hand while she lived. Small acts of quiet resistance, scattered across 27 years. None of them enough on their own, but together, eventually, enough to bring the whole false story down. I decided, that afternoon, that I didn't need one dramatic villain to make sense of what had happened to me. I needed the truth, finally out in the open and slowly, piece by piece. That's exactly what I was getting. Ryan asked me, during one of our Sunday calls that November, whether I could ever really forgive Frank for what he'd done. I told him the honest answer, which is that I didn't know yet, and that I didn't think forgiveness was something you could force onto a timeline just because it would make the story feel more finished. What I did know, I told him, was that I no longer carried the story the way I had for those first terrible weeks after the initial hearing, like a wound that had reopened out of nowhere. I understood, now, exactly where it had come from, exactly why it had happened, and exactly how long it had been quietly building underneath the surface of our family. Understanding didn't erase the pain, but it changed its shape, made it something I could hold instead of something that held me. "I keep thinking about how close I came to never finding out," Ryan said. "If Beth hadn't pushed, if Grandma had thrown those letters away instead of just refusing to open them again, if Gary hadn't finally said something, I could have gone my whole life thinking you chose to leave me." His voice caught. "I don't know how you're not angrier at all of them. At Dad, at Grandma, even at me for believing it so easily." I told him the truth, that I had been angry, furiously, in the weeks right after that first hearing, angrier than I'd let myself be in years. But somewhere in the process of unpacking that storage unit box, reading my own handwriting from 27 years earlier, I'd found something more useful to hold onto than anger. The simple, solid fact that I had, in fact, been the mother I always believed myself to be, even during the months I couldn't be present. The letters proved it. Nothing Frank did afterward could unwrite that. By December, something had genuinely shifted in how Ryan and I related to each other. Not back to some imagined before, because that before had always rested on a lie neither of us fully understood we were living inside. This was something new instead, built on more honest ground. He started bringing his own kids over, my grandchildren, 6-year-old Nora and 3-year-old Sam, for Sunday dinners at the bungalow on Merriman Road, and I found myself, at 55, getting a second chance at something I'd feared I'd already lost. One Sunday, Nora found the box of Eleanor's old drawings on my bookshelf and pulled out the one Ryan had shown me, the stick figure family with MOM standing beside Dad. She held it up and asked, in the direct way small children ask things, "Is this you, Grandma?" I told her yes, that was me, drawn by her daddy a long, long time ago, back when he was even smaller than Sam. She studied it for a moment with the total seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage, then said, "You look happy there." I told her I hoped I had been, and that I was working on being that happy again now. Ryan, watching from the kitchen doorway, caught my eye and didn't say anything, but I saw something pass over his face, relief, maybe, or a kind of grief finally settling into something gentler. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed at Beth's insistence, and it was just the two of us doing dishes, he said quietly, "I'm glad you didn't let what I said in that courtroom be the last word on who you are to me." I told him it never could have been. Some truths are too well documented to stay buried, even by the people most determined to keep them that way. I want to be honest that the road from that painful discovery to something like peace wasn't a straight line. There were nights that winter when the memory of Ryan's voice saying, "She was never a real mother to me," would surface out of nowhere, doing laundry, driving home from the office, and I'd have to pull over or sit down until it passed. Some betrayals, even ones you understand completely, leave a mark that doesn't disappear just because the facts got corrected. Carol was the one who helped me through those nights more than anyone. She'd sit with me on the phone at 11 at night sometimes, not saying much, just staying on the line until whatever wave had hit me receded. "You're allowed to still be hurt even after he apologized," she told me once. Understanding why someone hurt you doesn't erase the hurt. It just gives you somewhere to put it besides just anger. I started seeing a therapist again that January, my first time back in one since 1999, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who specialized in family estrangement and reconciliation. I told her, in our first session, that I felt strange being back in a therapist's office 27 years after the crisis that had started all of this, like I was closing some enormous loop I hadn't known was still open. She told me that made complete sense, that the wound from 1999 had never actually finished healing because it had been reopened, quietly, every single year that Frank's version of events stood unchallenged in Ryan's mind. By spring, I felt steadier than I had in over a year. Not fully healed. I don't think a thing like this ever fully heals, but rebuilt on ground I finally trusted, instead of ground I'd only assumed was solid. The following June, almost a year to the day after that first devastating hearing, Ryan asked me to come to a small gathering at his house. Nothing formal, he said, just family. When I arrived, I found Beth had set up a folding table in the backyard with lemonade and a cake, and Carol was already there, and Gary Pelham too, which surprised me. Ryan stood up when I sat down and said he wanted to say something out loud, in front of people, not just privately between the two of us. A year ago, I said something in a courtroom that wasn't true, and it hurt my mother in a way I don't think I fully understood until I read her own words back to her. I want everyone here to know that I was wrong, and that my mother spent 8 months in a hospital fighting to survive so she could come home to me, and then spent every year since actually being there, even when I didn't fully appreciate it. His voice wavered. I'm sorry it took me this long to say that clearly in front of people, the way I said the other thing in front of a judge. I felt tears on my face before I even registered I was crying. Gary raised his lemonade glass, of all things, and said, "To getting the story right, even late, And everyone laughed a little through their own tears, the particular kind of laughter that happens when grief and relief show up in the same moment. Frank wasn't there. Ryan had invited him, he told me privately afterward, but Frank had declined, saying he thought it should be a day about me and Ryan, not about him trying to insert himself into a reconciliation he wasn't sure he'd earned yet. It was, in its own small way, the most considerate thing Frank had done in this entire ordeal. I saw Frank once more that summer, at Nora's kindergarten graduation, both of us there as grandparents navigating a shared space for the first time since the divorce finalized. We ended up standing near each other by the punch table while the kids sang some off-key song about the alphabet, and after an awkward silence, he said, "You look well, Maggie." I told him I was actually doing well for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. He nodded, looked at his shoes for a moment, then said something I hadn't expected. "I've been seeing someone. A counselor, I mean. Not about the marriage, about the other thing. About why I did what I did with the letters." He looked genuinely uncomfortable admitting it, which told me it was probably true. 30 years is a long time to build a whole personality around never admitting you were scared of something. I told him I was glad, honestly, that he was doing that work, not for my sake or even entirely for Ryan's, but for his own. I told him understanding why he did it hadn't made me trust him again, and probably never fully would, but it had at least let me stop carrying quite so much anger around all the time, and that felt like something worth having regardless of where things stood between us. "Ryan's happier," Frank said, almost to himself, watching our grandchildren finish their song. "I can see it even from a distance. I'm glad, even if I know I'm not really part of why." I didn't correct him. It was, as far as apologies from Frank went, about as honest and unadorned as I'd ever heard him manage, and for the first time, I let myself believe he actually meant it. That autumn, Ryan asked me an unexpected question over Sunday dinner, whether I'd be willing to talk to a support group he'd found for adult children navigating estrangement or reconciliation with parents, not as someone in crisis, but as someone who'd lived through the other side of a false story finally correcting itself. "I keep thinking," he said, "about how many people out there probably grew up believing some version of the same lie I did and never got a storage unit full of letters to prove otherwise." I told him I'd think about it, and I did end up going, twice that winter, sitting in a community center basement in Fairlawn with a dozen strangers working through their own tangled family histories. I didn't have easy advice for any of them. My situation had resolved the way it did partly through sheer luck, a mother-in-law who couldn't bring herself to burn a box of letters, a daughter-in-law brave enough to dig through a dusty storage unit. Not every family gets a storage unit. Not every lie leaves behind its own contradiction, patiently waiting to be found. What I could offer, I told the group, was this: that the version of yourself someone else builds out of your absence is never the whole truth of who you actually were during that absence, even when you can't prove it the way I eventually could. Sometimes the proof exists and gets found. Sometimes it doesn't, and you have to hold on to the truth of yourself anyway, on faith, because you were there for it even if nobody else can verify it later. Ryan told me afterward that hearing me say that to strangers meant more to him than almost anything else that whole year. Proof, he said, that I'd turned what happened to us into something that could actually help someone else instead of just something that had hurt us. I want to talk about Beth for a moment, because I don't think this story works without her, and I don't want her courage to get lost in everything that happened afterward. She was the one who went digging in a dusty storage unit on a Saturday morning while her husband was at a job site with no idea what she was about to uncover. She was the one who sat with Ryan for 2 hours while he read letter after letter in silence, not pushing him, just staying present while his entire understanding of his mother rearranged itself. I asked her once, that winter, what had made her willing to risk her marriage's peace to dig up something that might have blown everything apart even worse than it already had. She thought about it for a long moment before she answered. "I watched Ryan say that thing on the stand," she said, "and I watched your face when he said it. And I thought, I don't ever want my own kids growing up believing something about me that isn't true, just because it was more convenient for someone else's story. If I let this go, I was basically deciding that was an acceptable way for families to work. I couldn't do that." I told her that made her one of the bravest people I'd met in this whole ordeal, braver than me in some ways, because she'd had less to gain from finding that truth than any of us, and had gone looking for it anyway, purely because it was the right thing to do. She'd hugged me hard when I said that, and told me she just hoped, someday, Nora and Sam would grow up understanding that their mother believed the truth was worth digging for, even when it was inconvenient, even when it risked upsetting people who preferred things stay buried. By the following spring, 2 years after that first devastating hearing, I'd settled fully into the bungalow on Merriman Road, sage green kitchen and all, and it had become something like a real home rather than just a place I'd landed after everything fell apart. Ryan and Beth came over most Sundays with the kids. Carol was over so often she practically had her own chair. Even Gary Pelham stopped by occasionally, an old family friend who'd found his own quiet redemption in finally speaking up when it mattered. I thought often, during that stretch, about the woman I'd been in 1999, 28 years old, terrified, certain in her darkest moments that she was failing her infant son simply by being too sick to function. I wished I could have told her, somehow, across all those years, that the letters she was writing in that hospital bed, believing they might be the only proof of her love that would ever reach her son, would eventually do exactly that, just 27 years later than she'd hoped. I also thought about Frank differently than I had during the worst of the hearings, not with warmth, exactly, but with a kind of settled clarity. He'd made a cowardly choice at 26 and then spent decades reinforcing it because admitting it would have cost him more than he was willing to pay. It hadn't made him a monster. It had made him a man who chose comfort over honesty for nearly 3 decades and who was only now, slowly, in his late 50s, starting to do the harder work he should have done at 26. I didn't need him to suffer for me to feel like the truth had finally won. I just needed my son to know, without question, exactly who his mother had always been. By that spring, he did. Ryan and I marked the 2-year anniversary of that first hearing quietly, just the two of us, sitting on my back porch with coffee while Beth took the kids to her sister's for the afternoon. He'd brought the original box of letters with him, the real ones from Eleanor's storage unit, and we went through a few more we hadn't read together yet. I used to think the worst day of my life was standing up in that courtroom and hearing myself say that about you, he told me. But I don't think that's true anymore. I think the worst day was actually every day before that for 27 years, when I believed something false about you and didn't even know there was anything to question. At least the hearing forced the lie into the open where it could finally break. I told him I understood exactly what he meant, because in a strange way, I felt the same about my own hospitalization, that the worst part hadn't been the 8 months I was actually sick, but the 27 years afterward when the truth of those months sat buried and unclaimed, doing damage in the dark that none of us could see or name. I don't think Dad will ever fully understand what he took from us, Ryan said. Not really. I think he understands the facts of it now. I don't think he understands what it actually felt like to grow up believing my mother chose not to love me enough to stay. He looked at me. But I understand it now. And I'm not going to let that story win, even this late. We sat together as the afternoon light shifted across the yard, two people who had lost each other to somebody else's cowardice and found their way back through nothing more than persistence, honesty, and a box of unopened letters. Small repairs kept happening after that, the kind that don't make for dramatic scenes but that add up over months into something like a whole rebuilt life. Ryan started including me in decisions about the kids in a way he hadn't before, asking my opinion about Nora's school, calling me first when Sam had a bad fever rather than waiting until it resolved to mention it. Small things. But they were the things a mother notices, the ones that tell you whether you're truly trusted or merely tolerated. Beth and I grew close enough that she started calling me for her own reasons, not just to relay something about Ryan, advice on a difficult client at her job, opinions on paint colors for their own house, once, memorably, a long call just to vent about her own mother, which felt like its own kind of honor, being trusted with an ordinary complaint instead of only crisis. Carol's role in all of it never diminished. She'd been there since the porch steps after that first terrible day, and she stayed exactly as present through every quieter chapter after. We started a standing Thursday dinner, just the two of us, a tradition that had nothing to do with a divorce or Ryan or Frank, just two sisters who'd weathered something hard together and wanted an ordinary evening now, and then to prove life could still be simple. Gary Pelham, of all people, became an unlikely fixture too, He retired from Doyle Auto Sales that spring. Tired, he said, of watching Frank rebuild his life with Renee while never quite reckoning fully with what he'd cost the rest of us. He started stopping by my place sometimes with vegetables from his garden, an old friend's quiet way of making amends for years of comfortable silence. I finally opened my own advertising firm's next chapter that year, something I'd put off during the worst of the divorce and its aftermath. Hired 2 junior copywriters, took on a bigger client downtown, put Betrayal energy back into the work that had always been mine, separate from being anyone's wife or mother. It felt important, somehow, to build something entirely my own in the same season I was rebuilding my relationship with Ryan, as if proving to myself that I'd always had a whole identity beyond the story Frank had tried to write for me. Ryan came by the office once, unannounced, just to see it, and stood in the doorway of my little conference room looking almost shy. "I don't think I ever really understood what your work meant to you," he said. "Growing up, it always got mentioned like it was the thing that took you away from me. I never thought about it as just you being good at something, building something real." I told him that was one of the quieter costs of the lie Frank told, not just that it painted my absence as abandonment, but that it turned my career, something I was genuinely proud of, into evidence against me, a thing to resent rather than a thing to admire. Reclaiming it, that year, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't realized had been quietly stolen alongside everything else. Ryan asked if he could bring Nora by sometime to see where her grandmother worked. I told him I'd love nothing more. A few weeks later, she sat in my office chair, spinning slowly, asking 100 questions about what all the framed advertisements on my wall meant, and I found myself, watching her, deeply grateful for a version of the future I hadn't been sure I'd get to have anymore. Frank reached out one more time that year, a letter this time, an actual letter, handwritten, which struck me as significant given everything. He didn't ask to see me. He wrote instead about the counseling he'd continued, about finally understanding, in his late 50s, that his own father's shame around anything emotional had shaped him more than he'd ever wanted to admit, and that he'd passed a version of that shame down to Ryan without ever meaning to. "I know I can't undo 27 years, the letter said. "I'm not writing this to ask you to forgive me, because I don't think that's mine to ask for anymore. I just wanted you to know I finally understand what I took from both of you, and I'm sorry it took losing so much to get there." I read it twice, sitting at my kitchen table, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of closure I hadn't realized I still needed. I didn't write back right away. I sat with it for a few weeks, let it settle, the way I'd learned to let most things settle since this whole ordeal began. Eventually, I did write a short reply, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. I told him I appreciated him finally naming what he'd done honestly, without excuses dressed up as explanations. I told him I hoped he kept doing the work, for his own sake and for Ryan's, and that I didn't need anything further from him beyond that. I didn't sign it love. I didn't need to pretend at something that wasn't there anymore. But I signed it, and I meant every word in it, and mailing it felt like closing a door gently instead of slamming it, which was, I realized, exactly the kind of ending I actually wanted. Ryan asked me, around that time, if I resented him for how long it had taken him to come around, for saying what he'd said in that first hearing before ever asking me directly what had really happened. I told him the truth, which is that I had resented it, briefly and fiercely, in those first raw weeks. But resentment, I'd learned, is a heavy thing to carry for very long, and I'd rather spend my remaining years building something with him than nursing something against him. "I think what actually mattered," I told him, "wasn't that you believed the lie for 27 years. It's that the moment real evidence existed, you didn't protect the comfortable version. You went and confronted your father with it directly. You corrected your testimony publicly, knowing it might look bad. You chose truth over convenience the second you actually had a choice to make. That's what I hold on to, not the mistake. What you did once you knew better." He was quiet for a while, and then he said something that stuck with me for a long time afterward. "I want Nora and Sam to grow up never having to dig through a storage unit to find out who their family actually is. I want them to just know because we tell them the truth as it happens, not 30 years later." I told him that was, in the end, the best possible thing to come out of everything we'd been through, not just repairing what had been broken between the two of us, but making sure the next generation never inherited the same silence. We sat together on my porch that evening, watching the last of the summer light fade over Merriman Road, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence between us felt like peace instead of distance. Carol and I talked one Thursday dinner that fall about how strange it was that the worst day of my life, sitting in that courtroom hearing my son call me not a real mother, had ended up being the day that finally cracked open 27 years of silence and led, eventually, to something more honest than anything we'd had before. "You'd never choose to go through it again," Carol said. "But you can still be grateful for where it led you. Even so, both things can be true." I thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. I thought about Eleanor, gone now 3 years before any of this even started, who'd made her own small, imperfect stand by refusing to destroy the letters, even though she never found the courage to hand them over herself. I thought about Gary, who'd stayed quiet for decades before finally speaking the truth he'd always half known. I thought about Beth, brave enough to dig through dust and cobwebs for a truth that could have blown her own marriage apart if it had gone differently. I thought about Ryan, standing in a courtroom the second time, correcting himself in front of a judge because it was the right thing to do, regardless of how it looked. And I thought about myself, 28 years old, hospitalized and terrified, writing letters to an infant son I wasn't sure I'd ever get to raise, believing those letters might be the only proof that would ever exist of how much I loved him. 27 years later, they became exactly that proof, arriving decades late but arriving nonetheless, undeniable, unerasable, finally read by the person they'd always been meant for. If you've stayed with me this long, I imagine you've had your own version of this. Maybe not a courtroom, maybe not a storage unit full of unopened letters, but some moment where someone you loved believed a story about you that wasn't true, and you had to find a way back to being truly known by them again. I don't think there's a single formula for that. I think it takes time, evidence when you're lucky enough to have it, and people brave enough to go looking for truth even when leaving well enough alone would be easier. I think about that courtroom sometimes still, the exact moment Ryan said those 6 words that felt like they erased 30 years in a single breath. I used to think that moment was the whole story, the worst thing that ever happened to me, full stop. Now I understand it was actually the moment the life finally broke the surface, after 27 years underground, where it could finally be seen and corrected instead of just quietly shaping everything from the shadows. I don't know what Frank and I will ever be to each other again. Polite grandparents sharing space at school events, probably nothing more, and that's all right with me. I don't need him back. I needed my son back, and unlikely as it once seemed, sitting frozen in that gallery watching Ryan walk to the stand, I got him. Not instantly, not easily, but fully in the end, in a way that feels more solid than anything we had before because it's finally built on something true. Nora asked me recently, with the blunt curiosity only a 7-year-old manages, why I don't see Grandpa Frank very much anymore. I told her the truth, in a way a child could understand, that Grandpa Frank and I made a lot of mistakes together, some of them big enough that we needed some distance to heal from them, but that everyone in the family still loved her very much, and none of what happened between the grown-ups was ever her fault, or her father's fault either, no matter what anyone believed for a while. She thought about that with the same total seriousness she'd once given the old stick figure drawing, then said, "I'm glad you and Daddy aren't confused about each other anymore." Out of the mouths of babes, as my own mother used to say. That was, in the end, the simplest and truest way anyone had described what had actually happened to us, a long, painful stretch of confusion about who I really was to my son, finally cleared up. If there's one thing I hope anyone watching this takes with them, it's this. If someone you love believes something false about you, don't assume time alone will fix it. Silence is not neutral. It gets filled in by whoever is standing closest, and if that person isn't you, they may fill it with something that isn't true at all. Speak the truth out loud, as early as you can, even when it's hard, even when it's inconvenient, even when you're afraid of how it will sound. The alternative, as I learned the hard way, can cost you 27 years. I'm 57 now, sitting on the same back porch on Merriman Road where Ryan and I read through those old letters together, coffee going cold beside me while I write this down for whoever needs to hear it. My son knows exactly who I am to him now, not through some quiet, unspoken assumption that showing up would eventually speak for itself, but through hard evidence, hard conversations, and a willingness on both our parts to keep digging until we found the truth, even when it would have been so much easier to just leave the story as it was. If you've made it all the way here with me, through a courtroom, a storage unit, 27 years of unopened letters, thank you for staying. Stories like this one don't heal on a fixed schedule, and I know some of you watching are still in the middle of your own version, without a neat resolution yet in sight. I don't have a magic answer for how long that takes. I only have what worked for us: patience, honesty even when it costs something, and people brave enough to keep looking for the truth instead of settling for the version that's easiest to believe. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear which part hit hardest for you down in the comments. I read everyone, and I promise this isn't the last story like this I have to tell. And if you know someone carrying a silence in their own family that's gone on far too long, maybe send this their way. Sometimes it just takes one person deciding the truth is worth the trouble of digging up. Thank you for being here with me. I'll see you in the next one.